The noise was the first thing he noticed, not as a sound, but as a physical presence. It pressed in on him, a thick blanket woven from the low hum of 100 conversations, the delicate clinking of ice in crystal glasses, and the occasional, sharp burst of laughter that sounded more like a social requirement than a genuine expression of joy. Julian Croft stood near the center of it all, a perfectly still pillar in a river of flowing silk and tailored wool. He held a flute of champagne but hadn't tasted it. The bubbles had long since gone flat, just as he felt his own spirit had. This gallery was a masterpiece of modern design. All stark white walls and polished concrete floors that reflected the art and the people in distorted, funhouse mirror shapes. The sculptures looked like tortured metal carcasses, and the paintings were vast blocks of color that were supposed to evoke profound emotions, but mostly made him think of expensive paint swatches. It was the kind of place where wealth came to look at itself. He was one of the main attractions, a living, breathing piece of art on display tonight. His presence was on the invitation. An evening with visionary art and Julian Croft. He hated it. He hated being treated like a prize exhibit. A man with a face like a contented bulldog and a suit that strained at the buttons clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Julian, my boy? Splendid to have you. Your last recording of the Preludes? Simply divine. I have it on in the car," the wife insists. Julian turned, his smile a mask he had perfected over decades. It reached his lips, but it stopped long before it could get anywhere near his eyes. "Thank you, sir. I'm glad you enjoyed it." The words were hollow. He didn't care if the man or his wife enjoyed it. He didn't remember recording it. Not really. It was just another day in a studio, another series of notes to be played with flawless precision, another product to be packaged and sold. The Bulldog man droned on about market shares and brand synergy, words that felt like gravel in Julian's ears. He nodded. He murmured agreements. He sipped his flat champagne, and all the while, his eyes scanned the room, looking for an escape route. He felt like a fraud. These people didn't love music. They loved the idea of loving music. They loved the prestige it gave them, the ability to say they knew him, had spoken with him. They didn't feel the vibration of the strings in their bones. The way a minor chord could feel like a homesickness for a place you've never been. They couldn't understand the sacred, terrifying space between the notes. For them, it was just elegant background noise for their lives of acquisition. He missed the boy he once was, a skinny kid in a dusty room, discovering an old upright piano and feeling for the first time that he wasn't alone in the world. That boy played because his soul demanded it. This man played because his schedule demanded it. Seeing an opening in the crowd, Julian excused himself with a mumbled word about finding a bit of air. He moved through the throng, his body on autopilot, his mind 1,000 miles away. He drifted away from the main exhibition hall, following a corridor that led to a smaller, more intimate wing. The noise faded behind him, replaced by a profound and welcome silence. This section was lit by softer, warmer lights. The art here was different, mostly classical landscapes, their colors muted and deep. It felt like a forgotten corner of the building, a place for quiet contemplation. And then he saw her. She was arranging a platter of miniature quiches on a long, white-clothed table. Her back was to him, and the first thing he noticed was the simple elegance of her posture. She moved with a fluid grace that seemed out of place in a room filled with rigid, angular sculptures. Her black server's uniform was plain, but it couldn't hide the gentle curve of her waist or the slender line of her neck. Her hair was a deep, rich brown, pulled back in a loose knot from which a few stray tendrils had escaped to brush against her skin. Even from a distance, there was a stillness about her, a quiet focus that was like a magnet to his weary soul. He found himself walking closer, his steps silent on the concrete floor. He wasn't trying to be stealthy. He was simply drawn. He stopped near a large, abstract painting that looked like a swirling storm cloud and watched her. She finished with the quiches and moved on to a bowl of glistening olives, her hands deft and sure. She was, he had to admit, exceptionally beautiful. It was the kind of beauty that made you look twice, not because it was loud or demanding, but because it seemed so complete, so self-contained. In his current state of mind, this was not a good thing. Beauty, in his experience, was almost always a shield for emptiness. It was a shortcut, a way to get through life without ever having to develop a mind or a character. It was a key that opened doors that should remain closed to the undeserving. He watched as a patron, a woman dripping in diamonds, stopped at the table. The woman said something to her, and Julian could see the slight tightening of the young woman's shoulders. She listened, her expression polite and attentive, then gave a small, respectful nod before turning back to her work. She handled the brief, dismissive interaction with a quiet dignity that most of the guests in the main. Hall couldn't have feigned if they tried. He felt a flicker of something. A tiny crack in the thick shell of his cynicism, but he quickly plastered over it. It was probably just an act. A well-rehearsed performance for the help. He glanced around the room, and his eyes landed on the one object that didn't quite fit. In the far corner, positioned beneath a single dramatic spotlight, stood a gleaming black grand piano. It was a top-of-a-line model, a Steinway & Sons, its polished surface reflecting the warm lights like a pool of dark water. It was, he realized, purely decorative. A prop, a symbol of sophistication for the people who owned the gallery, none of whom could likely play a note. It was an expensive piece of furniture, as hollow and meaningless as the compliments he received all night. And then, a truly terrible idea, born of boredom and a deep-seated resentment, began to form in his mind. It was a mischievous, unkind impulse, a small act of rebellion against the entire vapid world he was forced to inhabit. He looked back at the young woman, who was now carefully pouring a pitcher of water. Here was this beautiful girl, this perfect symbol of the superficiality that surrounded him. And over there was this beautiful piano, another symbol. What would happen if you put them together? It would be a harmless bit of fun for him, a private experiment. He was almost certain of the outcome. She would probably giggle, place a hesitant finger on a key, and then look at him with those big, beautiful eyes, expecting praise for simply trying. It would confirm everything he believed, and the confirmation, in its own twisted way, would be a comfort. A slow, predatory smile touched his lips. He straightened his tie, smoothed the lapel of his jacket, and put on his most charming, disarming expression. This was a performance he could still sink his teeth into. He walked towards her, his footsteps now deliberately audible. She heard him coming and turned, her professional smile instantly in place. It was a nice smile, polite and reserved, but it held a distance that intrigued him for a second. "Excuse me," he began, his voice a low, smooth purr he knew people found captivating. "I hope I'm not in your way." "Not at all, sir," she replied. Her voice was softer than he expected, with a clear, pleasant tone. "Can I get you something? A glass of water?" "No, thank you. I was just admiring the quiet in this part of the gallery. A welcome escape." "Ah, it is a lovely space," she agreed, her eyes briefly scanning the room before returning to him. She was respectful, but not starstruck. Either she didn't know who he was, or she was an exceptionally good actress. "I'm Julian, by the way," he said, extending a hand. Leaving out his famous last name. "Lara," she replied, taking his hand for a brief, firm shake. Her touch was cool and dry. She didn't gush or simper. She just said her name, as if it were the most normal thing in the world to be shaking hands with a guest. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ella." He let his gaze drift from her face to the piano in the corner. He could feel the pieces of his little game clicking into place. He gave a small, casual laugh. "It's funny, they put a magnificent instrument like that in here, and I doubt one person in this entire building could do it justice." Looked back at her, watching her reaction. Her eyes followed his to the piano, and for the first time, her professional mask seemed to slip. A look he couldn't quite decipher, part longing, part sadness, crossed her features. It was there and gone in a flash, replaced by her polite neutrality, but he had seen it. For a fleeting moment, it unsettled him. He pushed the feeling aside. "You play, don't you?" He asked, the question laced with an easy, condescending charm. "You look like you have a soul for it." The question hung in the air between them, light and casual on his side, but landing with a much heavier weight on hers. Ilara's polite smile didn't waver, but something in her eyes shifted. The polished surface of her server's persona seemed to ripple, as if a stone had been dropped into a still, deep pond. She looked at him for a long moment, not with the flattered surprise he had anticipated, but with a quiet, probing curiosity, as if she were trying to decipher the true meaning behind his simple, teasing words. Julian met her gaze, his own expression a perfect picture of harmless amusement. He could see he had piqued her interest, and it gave him a small thrill. He was the master of this game. He knew exactly how to play people, how to say the right thing to get the reaction he wanted. He was an artist, after all, and the piano was just one of his instruments. Human nature was another. A soul for it, she repeated softly, her voice barely a whisper. The words were not a question, but a thoughtful echo. She turned her head slowly, her eyes finding the grand piano again. It sat there under its single spotlight, like a performer waiting on an empty stage. The longing he'd seen flicker in her face before returned, stronger this time. It was a look so raw and unguarded that it almost made him uncomfortable. It was the look of a starving person staring through a window at a feast. He pushed the slight discomfort away. It was just part of the act, he told himself. A performance to draw him in. He leaned a little closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. You can tell. Some people just look at a piano and see a piece of furniture, a box with black and white teeth. But others, they see something else. They see a whole world in there, waiting to be unlocked. He gestured towards the instrument with an elegant flourish of his hand. You have that look? Lar finally turned back to him. Her mask was back in place, but now it felt different, more deliberate. I think that's a very kind thing to say, but I'm just here to make sure everyone has enough to eat and drink. Gah. A classic deflection. He had expected it. She was playing her part well. Of course, he said, his tone dripping with understanding. But even the most responsible people deserve a little fun, don't they? He straightened up a new energy in his posture. It was time to move the game forward. Come on, a small detour. No one will notice. I promise it won't get you in trouble. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and began walking towards the piano, a confident swagger in his step. He was counting on her natural politeness, on her inability to refuse a guest, especially one who was clearly a person of importance. He heard the soft sound of her shoes following him, a hesitant rhythm against his purposeful stride. He had her. When they reached the piano, he ran a hand lovingly along its smooth, curved side. A beautiful instrument, he said, more to himself than to her. Deserves to be sung. He sat down on the polished bench, the leather cool beneath him. He didn't look at her, but he could feel her standing just behind him, a quiet, uncertain presence. He flexed his fingers, the movements so practiced they were almost unconscious. He felt the familiar weight of the keys beneath his fingertips, a comforting power. This was his kingdom. Here, he was not the bored celebrity. He was the monarch. He could make this room weep or rejoice with just a touch. He decided to show her the kind of world he was talking about. He decided to show her the mountain she had to climb. He began to play. The piece he chose was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the opening chords. He chose it for a reason. It wasn't just technically demanding. It was emotionally devastating. It started with a series of deep, resonant chords, like the tolling of great bells in a vast, empty cathedral. The sound filled the small gallery, instantly chasing away the silence. It was a sound that demanded you listen, a sound that spoke of profound loneliness and immense, aching beauty. His fingers moved across the keys with a fluid, almost supernatural grace. He played it perfectly, of course. Every note was in its place, every dynamic, flawlessly executed. He put on a masterclass in technical brilliance. It was a performance designed to intimidate, to show her the sheer scale of what she could never do. The music swelled, a dark, powerful wave of sound that seemed to rise up from the very floorboards. He poured all his jaded bitterness, all his professional frustration, into the playing. It was beautiful, but it was cold. It was a perfect, intricate ice sculpture. He played the opening theme, a melody that was both heartbreaking and heroic. And then, as it reached its peak, He let his hands fall away from the keys. The last note faded into a profound silence. It hung in the air for a moment, a ghost of sound, before being swallowed by the quiet of the room. Julian let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of his performance to settle. He was still looking at the keys, but he could feel her reaction or lack thereof. She hadn't gasped or applauded. She hadn't said a word. It was exactly what he wanted. He had stunned her into silence. He turned on the bench, a slow, deliberate movement. He looked up at her, a faint, self-satisfied smile playing on his lips. He expected to see her looking awestruck, intimidated, maybe even a little scared. Instead, her face was a complete blank. Her eyes were fixed not on him, but on the piano, as if she were seeing something he wasn't. The look on her face was one of deep, almost painful concentration. She was listening to the echo of the music, not as a performance, but as a message. He found it a little unsettling. He had expected her to be focused on him, the famous pianist, but she seemed to have forgotten he was even there. "Well," he said, his voice soft but edged with challenge. "What do you think?" Her eyes slowly drifted from the keys to his face. The blankness in her expression was replaced by something else, something he couldn't quite read. "It's a very sad story," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Julian was taken aback. That wasn't the answer he was looking for. He had expected it was beautiful, or I could never do that. He had not expected her to call it a story. "Sad," he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "I suppose it is." Rachmaninoff was a man who knew a great deal about melancholy. "It feels like someone is lost," she continued, her gaze returning to the piano. "And they're trying to remember the way home, but the path has disappeared. And they're calling out, but there's no one there to answer." Her description was so simple, so pure, that it cut right through his layers of intellectual cynicism. He had spent years studying the theory, the history, the technical construction of this piece. He could talk for hours about its modulations and its thematic development. But she, in a few sentences, had described its soul. He felt a strange, unwelcome prickle on the back of his neck. He pushed it down. It was a lucky guess. "A pretty, poetic phrase. It's one of the most difficult pieces to play," he said, his tone turning slightly condescending again, reasserting his authority. "The first few bars alone are a nightmare for most concert pianists." He stood up from the bench, making a grand, inviting gesture towards it. "But you already knew that, didn't you?" You could hear it in the story. He was goading her now, gently pushing her towards the edge of the cliff he had prepared for her. "Come on," he said, his voice softening into a persuasive, friendly tone. "Just for fun. No one's listening. It's just you, me, and the old ghost of Rachmaninoff." He gave her a disarming grin. "Let's see if you can find the path home. Just try to play the first few chords. See if you can even find them. If you do, I'll be more impressed than by anyone out there." He was being cruel, and he knew it. He was setting her up for a gentle, public, but private failure. It was his bit of fun for the evening. He was a scientist, and this was his experiment. Alara looked from his smiling face to the empty piano bench. For a moment she seemed to hesitate. He could see the war going on inside her. The professional obligation to refuse warring with some deeper, more powerful pull. He held his breath, waiting to see which side would win. He was so sure of the outcome. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, she seemed to make her decision. She walked past him, her movements once again fluid and graceful, and stood before the piano. She didn't sit down immediately. Instead, she looked at it for a long time, her expression one of quiet reverence. She slowly raised one hand, her fingers slender and pale, and gently let it hover over the keys, not touching them, just feeling the air above them. It was a gesture so intimate, so full of respect, that it made Julian's own practiced performance feel clumsy and crude in comparison. Finally, she sat down on the bench. She adjusted her posture, not stiffly, but with a natural, easy alignment, as if her body already knew what it needed to do. She placed her hands in her lap, took a single deep breath, and then lifted them to the keys. Julian leaned against the wall a few feet away, folding his arms over his chest. He settled in, a spectator waiting for the show to begin. The smile was back on his face, confident and superior. He had set the stage, he had played his overture, and now it was time for the main act to fail. He was ready for her to fumble, to look back at him with an embarrassed little laugh, to say, "I'm sorry, I can't." He was ready for the confirmation that his world, his cynical, empty world, was the only one that was real. He watched her fingers, poised over the keys, and waited. The silence in the gallery was no longer empty. It was charged, pregnant with the echo of Julian's performance and the weight of his challenge. He stood with his arms folded, a smug smile playing on his lips, his entire posture radiating a patient, predatory confidence. He was a hunter who had cornered his prey, and he was simply waiting for it to make the final, inevitable stumble. He watched Alara's slim, elegant fingers hovering over the ivory keys, almost pitying her for what he was about to put her through. Then her fingers descended. They did not strike the keys. They settled upon them, as a lover's hand might rest upon a beloved's cheek. There was no hesitation, no fumbling search for the right notes. Her left hand found the deep, resonant chords of the opening theme with an unerring certainty. The sound that bloomed from the piano was not a copy of his. It was a continuation, a deeper breath taken after his own had been released. The first chord vibrated through the polished, concrete floor and up into the soles of Julian's shoes. It was the same chord he had played, the exact same notes, yet it was utterly, fundamentally different. His had been a demonstration of power, a perfect mathematical calculation of sound. Hers was a confession. The tone was darker, fuller, imbued with a sorrow so profound it felt ancient. It was not the sadness of a romantic poet. It was the sadness of a field that has known battle, of a stone that has weathered 1,000 storms. Julian's smile vanished. He uncrossed his arms without realizing it, his body straightening from its lazy, confident slump. His eyes, which had been watching with detached amusement, were now fixed on her hands, on the way her fingers seemed to be drawing the music up from the very heart of the instrument. He had expected a clumsy imitation, a hesitant attempt to follow his lead, but she was not following him. She was walking a path that he had merely pointed to, and she walked it as if she had been born on it. Her right hand entered, playing the simple, haunting melody that floated above the deep chords. And this is where Julian's world truly began to crack. The precision was there, a startling, flawless accuracy that should have been impossible for anyone who hadn't dedicated thousands of hours to practice. But it was the emotional weight that completely disarmed him. He had played the melody with a brilliant, technical perfection. She played it with a tenderness that made his own heart ache. Each note was not just a pitch. It was a memory. It was the sound of a lullaby sung in a language long forgotten. It was the feeling of a mother's hand on a fevered forehead. He felt the cynical wall he had built around his heart, a wall that had stood for years against fawning admirers and soulless events, begin to tremble. This wasn't a game anymore. This was something real. This was something pure. Alara's eyes were closed. She was no longer in the gallery. The harsh, modern lighting, the stark white walls, the man watching her from across the room, it had all faded away. She was somewhere else, somewhere Julian could not see. Her body was still, but her music was a raging river of emotion. It flowed from her, through the keys, and into the room, filling every corner with its story. The story she had described a soul lost in calling out was no longer just a poetic interpretation. She was living it. She was the one who was lost, and she was the one who was calling. As the phrase continued, she began to improvise. It was subtle at first, a slight hesitation where there shouldn't have been one, a softer dynamic on a note that was meant to be sung with force. But then the deviations grew bolder. She took Rachmaninoff's theme and wove her own thread into it. She introduced a counter-melody, a whisper of a tune that sounded like a folk song from some old, distant country. It was a song of longing, of a deep bone weariness, but threaded through it was a flicker of something else. Defiance, a tiny, unbreakable spark of hope. It was the sound of a candle burning in a hurricane. Julian was speechless. He had played this piece 100 times, on 100 different stages, for 100 different audiences. He had taught it to master students. He had analyzed it note by note. He thought he knew it. He realized now, with a feeling that was both humbling and terrifying, that he had only ever known the map. She knew the territory. His mind, usually so sharp and analytical, was a blur. He tried to grasp what was happening, to put a label on it, to dissect it with his technical knowledge. It's the touch, he thought. Her legato is perfect. Her use of the pedal is intuitive. But these were just words, clinical and useless. They were like trying to describe the color of the sky by talking about the chemical composition of the air. This wasn't about technique. It was about truth. Every single note she played was honest. There was no ego in her playing, no desire to impress, no showing off. There was only the music itself laid bare. It was the most courageous thing he had ever heard. He could feel his own history, his own pride melting away in the face of it. He remembered the first time he had truly felt music, as that skinny boy in the dusty room, playing for himself and for no one else. He remembered the pure, unadulterated joy of it. When had that joy turned into a job? When had the music become a means to an end, the way to earn fame, to fill concert halls, to justify his own existence? He had been so busy being Julian Croft, the renowned pianist, that he had forgotten the boy who simply loved the sound the piano made. And here was this young woman, this server in a plain black uniform, who was playing with a passion and a sincerity that he had lost decades ago. She was not just playing the piano. She was reminding him of everything he had lost. The music swelled again. And this time, the defiance in her melody became stronger. It was no longer a flicker. It was a flame. It was the sound of someone who had been pushed down over and over again, but who refused to stay there. It was a cry not of despair, but of survival. The chords she played were heavier, fuller, shaking the very foundations of the room. Julian could feel it in his chest, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to match the trembling in his own soul. He had come into this room feeling like a god, a master of his domain, looking down on the beautiful but empty girl he had decided to test. Now he felt like a beggar at the gates of a cathedral he hadn't even known existed. The roles had been reversed so completely, so utterly, that he felt dizzy. He was no longer the judge. He was the one being judged, and he was being found wanting. The final chord hung in the air, a sound of immense power and unbearable sorrow. But beneath it, that note of resilience still lingered, a promise that the story was not over. It faded slowly, reluctantly, leaving a silence in its wake that was more profound, more meaningful than any music he had ever heard. In that silence, Julian Croft, the man who commanded standing ovations from thousands, did not move. He could not. He was frozen, not by awe, but by a deep seismic shift within himself. His carefully constructed world of cynicism and superiority had just been shattered by a few dozen notes played by a girl he had. Intended to mock, Illyra's fingers rested on the keys for a moment longer, as if they were reluctant to leave. Then, with a soft sigh, she pulled her hands away and placed them back in her lap. She opened her eyes. The spell was broken. The faraway look in her gaze receded, and the reality of the gallery came back into focus. She seemed a little dazed, as if waking from a vivid dream. She turned her head and looked at him. And in that moment, Julian felt a wave of shame so hot and sharp, it was like a physical blow. Her face was open, soft, and a little uncertain. There was no trace of arrogance or pride in her expression. She wasn't looking for praise. She was just looking at him, the man who had asked her a question. The man who was now staring at her with an expression of utter, naked shock. He, the great orator, the master of the witty comeback, had no words. He was a fool, and she had just, in the most gentle and profound way possible, shown him his own foolishness. The silence stretched between them, no longer charged, but filled with a new and fragile thing. It was the silence of a man who had just seen the stars for the first time. The silence that followed Illyra's last note was a living thing. It filled the small gallery, pressing in on Julian, heavier and more real than the noise of the party he had fled. He stood frozen, his body rigid, his mind a complete blank. The smug, superior shell he had worn like a second skin for so long was not just cracked. It was shattered, blown to dust, and he was standing there, exposed and raw. All the witty comebacks, all the condescending observations, all the cynical certainties he had armed himself with were gone. He had nothing. He was just a man who had heard the truth and was utterly undone by it. Ilara was the first to move. She blinked slowly, her gaze returning from whatever distant place she had been. She looked down at her hands resting in her lap, as if noticing them for the first time. Then she looked back at him. Her expression wasn't triumphant or proud. It was soft, a little shy, and tinted with a quiet concern, as if she were worried she had done something wrong. This simple human look from her was like a final, gentle push, and the wall of his pride crumbled completely. He pushed himself away from the wall he'd been leaning against. The movement felt stiff, uncoordinated. He felt like an old man. He crossed the few feet of space between them, his footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He stopped by the piano, not looking at her, but at the keys she had just touched. He couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes, not yet. He was afraid of what she would see in his. He began. But his voice was a hoarse, unfamiliar thing. He cleared his throat, the sound harsh and ugly in the sacred quiet. He tried again. I am so sorry. The words were inadequate. They were a paper cup trying to hold an ocean, but they were all he had. Ilara tilted her head slightly, a look of genuine confusion on her face. Sorry? For what? She asked, her voice as gentle as her playing. You asked me to play? He finally forced himself to look at her, and the honesty in her eyes was almost painful. It would have been so much easier if she were gloating, if she had some ego for him to resent. But she didn't. She was just Ilara, a person who had shared a piece of her soul, and was now looking at him with simple, direct kindness. For my test, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. For my arrogance, I thought I was being clever. I thought I was. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, ashamed to even articulate the ugliness of his own thoughts. I had no idea, he finally managed to say. I have never in my life. I have never heard anything like that. He had intended to sound grateful, appreciative, but the words came out choked with emotion. He felt a stinging heat behind his eyes and had to turn away, walking a few steps toward the gallery window. He stared out at the city lights, but he didn't see them. All he could see was the memory of her fingers on the keys. The memory of a sound so pure it had cleansed and destroyed him all at once. She didn't say anything. She just waited, giving him the space he so clearly needed. Her silence was a gift. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to compose himself. He was Julian Croft. He didn't lose control. But he had just been on the receiving end of something far more powerful than his own fame or talent. And he had to surrender to it. He turned back to her, his expression raw, his defenses completely gone. How? He asked, the question not one of intellectual curiosity, but of desperate, pleading need. How is that possible? Where did you learn to play like that? Ilara looked down at her hands again. A small, sad smile touched her lips. I didn't learn it, she said softly. It was just there. Julian frowned, not understanding. There, what do you mean? My grandmother, she began, her voice taking on a warm, nostalgic tone. She was the musician, not like you, in big halls. Her world was smaller. She lived in a country that doesn't really exist anymore. She was a concert pianist there, a very good one, everyone said. But then, things changed. There was a war, and the world she knew was broken. She paused, her eyes distant. She escaped. She came here with nothing but the clothes she wore and the music in her head. She tried to build a new life, but her hands, they were damaged by the journey, by the work she had to do. Arthritis. By the time I was old enough to really know her, she could barely hold a teacup. She could never play the piano again. Julian felt a profound sense of grief for this woman he had never met, a grief that was instantly familiar. It was the same sorrow he had just heard in Ilara's music. The piano in our apartment was old and out of tune, Ilara continued. It sat in the corner like a ghost. My grandmother couldn't play it, but she loved it. She would sit next to me on the bench, and she would hum. She would tell me stories about the music. She wouldn't say, "This is a C-sharp minor." She would say, "This part is the color of the sky just before a storm," or "This chord feels like the first snow of winter." She taught me not just the notes, but the feelings behind them. She taught me to listen for the story. She looked up at Julian, her eyes shining. I would play what she hummed. We would spend hours like that, her in my head and me at the keys. It was our language. It was how we talked. The picture she painted was so vivid, so beautiful and heartbreaking, that Julian felt he could almost see them. The old woman, her hands crippled, but her spirit free, pouring her life's passion into her granddaughter. The young girl, her small hands finding the notes on the yellowed keys, translating the love and the loss into sound. She passed away last year, Ilara said, her voice wavering just a little. I haven't really played much since. It felt too lonely. The piano was just a silent box again. Julian finally understood. The sorrow he heard wasn't just Rachmaninoff's. It was the sorrow of a war-torn country. It was the grief for a lost dream, for a crippled talent. The resilience he felt wasn't just a composer's defiance. It was the strength of a woman who built a new world from nothing, and the love of a granddaughter who was keeping her memory alive. She wasn't playing for him. She was playing for her. She was playing with her grandmother's ghost, sitting beside her on the bench. He felt like such a fool. He had looked at this beautiful young woman and seen only a superficial object, a prop for his own amusement. He never once imagined the universe of history, of love, and of loss that was contained within her. He had been so busy listening to the sound of his own importance that he had forgotten how to truly hear. "You shouldn't stop," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You have a gift, Ilara. It's not just playing the piano. It's something else entirely. It's a voice that people need to hear." She gave a small, dismissive shrug. "It's just for me. A memory. It's more than that," he insisted, a new passion rising in him. It wasn't the passion for his own performance, but a burning need to protect and nurture what he had just witnessed. The world has enough technicians. It has enough people like me who can play all the right notes in all the right ways. But we don't have enough truth-tellers. That's what you are. You tell the truth." The compliment was so sincere, so deeply felt, that a faint blush rose on Ilara's cheeks. She looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. "I don't know what to do with that," she admitted quietly. "You don't have to do anything with it," Julian said. "You just have to let it out." An idea began to form in his mind, an idea that felt right, the first truly right thing he had thought of all night. "I have a studio. A quiet place. A good piano. No audiences. No pressure. Just ... music. I would like to hear you play again. Not as a test. Not as a performance. Just to listen." He saw a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. "I couldn't impose. You're a very busy man." "No," he said, cutting her off gently but firmly. "I am not. I thought I was, but I was just busy being an idiot. This is the first real thing I've done in years. Please, let me share this with you. Let me introduce you to my piano. I think they would like each other." A slow, genuine smile finally broke through her shyness. It was a beautiful smile, not because it made her face more beautiful, but because it came from a place of real warmth and connection. "I think I would like that," she said. He felt a sense of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. He had come into this room looking for a cheap thrill, a way to pass the time. He was leaving it having found something he hadn't even realized he was searching for, a spark, a reason. He wasn't the renowned pianist, and she wasn't the beautiful server anymore. In that quiet gallery, under the watchful eye of the art, they were just two people who had connected in the most unexpected and profound of ways. And as they stood there, a silent promise hung in the air between them, promise of new beginnings, and the sound of music that was finally, truly free. The world outside the gallery had not changed. The city still glittered with the same cold and different lights. The people inside were still drinking champagne and talking about things that didn't matter. But for Julian, the world had been fundamentally rearranged. He walked out of the gallery not with the weary sense of escape he had felt going in, but with a quiet, purposeful stride. He felt like he was carrying something fragile and incredibly precious inside him, and he knew he had to protect it. He didn't go back to the party. He didn't say his goodbyes to the bulldog man or the hostess with the dangling diamonds. He simply walked out, got into his car, and drove home. The expensive leather interior of the car felt different. The silence was no longer an escape. It was a space to listen. And all he could hear, replaying in his mind, were the notes Ilara had played. They weren't just a memory. They were a presence. They were the sound of a new door opening in a house he thought he knew every room of. The next few days were a blur of activity for him, but it was an activity fueled by a new energy. He made phone calls, not to agents or concert promoters, but to people he hadn't spoken to in years, a trusted old friend who ran a small, respected music academy, a luthier who maintained his personal instruments. His world, which had been so focused on the grand stage, was suddenly shrinking, becoming more intimate, more focused. He spent hours in his own studio, a sunlit room at the top of his house that had become more of a showroom than a workshop. For the first time in a long time, he cleaned it himself. He dusted the sheet music, polished the wood of his own magnificent Fazioli piano, and cleared away the clutter of industry magazines and promotional photos. He was preparing the room not for a guest, but for a pilgrimage. He called Ilara, his heart pounding with a nervousness he hadn't felt since his first major recital. When she answered, her voice was the same quiet, gentle sound he remembered. He spoke carefully, trying to convey his sincerity without overwhelming her. He suggested a day, a time. He gave her his address, not like a celebrity giving out a location, but like a friend inviting someone into his home. She agreed, her simple okay carrying a weight of trust that humbled him. The day she was to arrive, Julian found himself pacing. He had a million things he could have been doing, reviewing contracts, practicing for an upcoming tour, but none of it seemed important. He just waited. When the doorbell rang, he felt a jolt, like an electric shock. He opened the door to see her standing there, looking small and a little out of place on his grand doorstep. She was wearing a simple dress and carrying a worn canvas bag. She didn't look like a budding musical prodigy. She looked like a young woman coming to visit a friend. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "I'm so glad you could make it." He led her not into the formal living room, but straight up the wide, curved staircase to his studio. He watched her face as she entered the room. Her eyes went immediately to the piano, a gleaming black giant that sat in the center of the room, bathed in the soft light from the large window. But then she looked around at the room itself, the books lining the walls, the comfortable armchair in the corner, the scattered handwritten scores on the music desk. A look of wonder came over her face. It wasn't the look of someone impressed by wealth, but of a musician stepping into a sanctuary. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It feels like a place where music lives." "That's the nicest thing anyone has ever said about this room," Julian said, and he meant it. People usually commented on the view or the expensive equipment. She saw the soul of the place. He gestured towards the piano. "She's all yours, please." Ilara walked slowly towards it, her hand trailing lightly over the back of a chair. She stood before the piano for a long time, just looking at it. Then she sat down on the bench. She didn't play a note. She just sat, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes closed. She was breathing in the space, connecting with the instrument. Julian sat down in the armchair in the corner, making himself as small and quiet as possible. He was not a teacher here. He was a student. He was there to learn. After a few minutes, her hands rose to the keys. She began to play, and it was not Rachmaninoff this time. It was a simple melody, something she was creating right there in the moment. It was tentative at first, like a person exploring a new path. The notes were clear and pure, and they told a story of their own. It was the story of her arrival in this new place, a story of a little fear and a lot of curiosity. Julian listened, completely captivated. He could hear the influences in her playing, the classical structure from her grandmother's lessons, the soulful folk melodies she had woven into the concerto. But he could also hear something else, something entirely her own. It was a voice of quiet strength and immense compassion. He sat there for over an hour, completely motionless, as she played, improvising one story after another. The music flowed like a river, sometimes calm and reflective, sometimes swelling with a quiet, powerful emotion. He didn't offer a single word of criticism or advice. He just listened. When she finally finished, the silence that fell was comfortable, warm, and full. She turned on the bench to look at him, a question in her eyes. "I have no words," Julian said, shaking his head in wonder. "I truly have no words." He stood up and walked over to the piano. "You know," he said, "my friend I told you about at the music academy? He could give you a scholarship. He could place you with the best teachers. You could have a career, a real one. You could play on the world's stages." He watched her face as he said it. He expected to see excitement, gratitude, maybe even awe. Instead, he saw a flicker of fear, a shadow of uncertainty. The idea of a stage of competing and performing for judges seemed to shrink her. It felt like a cage. "I don't know if I can do that," she said softly. "My music. It's not for competing. It's just for listening." And in that moment, Julian understood. He had been trying to give her the world he knew, the world of fame and pressure and perfection. But her gift didn't belong in that world. It was too pure, too honest. It would be crushed. "You're right," he said, the realization dawning on him with a sudden clarity. "You're absolutely right. That's not what this is about." He thought for a moment, a new idea taking shape, one that felt so much more right. "So we don't do that. We do something else. We play together, not as a teacher and a student, as two musicians. You have a story to tell, and I have. Well, I have the means to help you tell it. We could record it, just for us. No audience, no critics. Just you, me, and a microphone. So the music is not lost again." He saw her eyes light up at that. The idea of creation, of collaboration, of preserving the music for its own sake, was something she could understand. It honored her grandmother not by turning her memory into a competition prize, but by giving it a voice that could outlive them both. "I would like that," she said, a real, brilliant smile spreading across her face. "I would like that very much." So that is what they did. They spent their afternoons in the sunlit studio. Ilara would play, her music flowing freely, and Julian would listen. Sometimes he would join in, not by trying to lead or to impress her, but by adding his own voice to hers. His playing began to change. The cold, technical precision started to melt away, replaced by a warmth and an emotion he thought he had lost forever. He was no longer playing for an audience of thousands. He was playing for an audience of one. He was playing for her. He was playing with her. And in doing so, he was finally, truly, playing for himself. The story didn't end with Ilara on a grand stage, accepting a thunderous applause. It ended much more quietly. It ended in a small studio on a sunny afternoon, the sound of two pianos weaving together in a conversation that was more real than any words. It ended with a renowned pianist who had found his music again. Not in the roar of the crowd, but in the quiet. Soulful notes of a 20-year-old woman who had reminded him why the music mattered in the first place. He had come into her life looking for a moment of fun, but he had left with a lifetime of purpose. And she had come into his life as a server, but she left as a teacher, showing him that the most beautiful music is not the one that is played the loudest, but the one that comes from the most honest place in the heart.